What if you woke up one morning, went to the ATM to withdraw cash, and the machine swallowed your card? You go to the bank, closed. You try to pay for your coffee, your money is refused. Not because your account is empty, but because overnight, your government has decided that the money you saved your entire life is now worth less than the paper it's printed on. What would you do? Where would you go? How would you feed your family tonight? This actually happened. Not in a movie, not in a dystopian novel. It happened to millions of ordinary people, teachers, bakers, nurses, factory workers in Germany in 1923. And the survival strategies they invented are so extraordinary, so deeply human, that most history books don't even mention them. If you want to discover how they did it, stay with us. Because what you're about to hear might change the way you think about money forever. In the years following World War I, Germany was in ruins. Not just physically, but financially. The Treaty of Versailles had forced the country to pay enormous war reparations to the Allied powers, debts so large they seemed impossible to repay. The German government faced a choice: raise taxes on a devastated population or print money. They chose to print. At first, it seemed to work. The economy kept moving, wages were paid, businesses stayed open. But underneath, a slow catastrophe was building, one that would eventually consume the savings, the stability, and the future of an entire generation. In January 1922, $1 could be exchanged for 192 German marks. That number sounds large already, but by the summer of 1923, that same dollar bought 353,000 marks. And by November of that year, just 10 months later, one single American dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Think about what that means for a moment. If you had saved 100,000 marks in 1921, enough to buy a comfortable home, by late 1923, that money would not buy you a single newspaper. Your life savings gone, not stolen, not lost in a market crash. Simply printed away, dissolved into worthlessness by a government that kept adding zeros to banknotes as if zeros were free. Because, to them, they were. Prices in Germany during 1923 doubled every 3.5 days, not every year, not every month, every 3.5 days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200,000 million marks by November. Workers at factories stopped accepting weekly wages. They demanded to be paid twice a day. Once at noon, once at the end of the shift, because the money they earned in the morning was worth measurably less by the afternoon. Wives and family members would wait at factory gates at lunch time to grab the morning wages and immediately run to the nearest shop to spend them before they lost more value. Standing in a queue for too long could mean the price changed before you reached the counter. Restaurants stopped printing menus because the prices changed faster than they could be reprinted. Some placed small chalkboards on the tables, updating prices by the hour. The German government printed banknotes so fast that the ink couldn't dry quickly enough. At the peak of the crisis, over 300 paper mills and 2,000 printing presses were running around the clock just to produce currency. The Reichsbank employed 1,783 people whose sole job was to count and manage banknotes. At one point, the total amount of currency in circulation was so vast that it was easier to measure it by weight than by value. Banks would deliver money to businesses not in bags, but in laundry baskets, wooden crates, and wheelbarrows. The image that became the symbol of the Weimar hyperinflation, a man pushing a wheelbarrow overflowing with paper marks just to buy a few groceries, was not a metaphor. It was a daily reality for millions of people trying to survive. But here is what history tends to forget. People survived. Not all of them, and not without extraordinary hardship. But ordinary German men and women developed survival strategies so creative, so deeply human, so surprisingly effective, that they deserve to be studied and remembered. Because these strategies did not disappear with the Weimar Republic. They reappeared, almost identically, in Argentina in 2001, in Zimbabwe in 2008, in Venezuela in 2016. And understanding them may be more relevant today than at any point in the last 50 years. The first and most fundamental survival strategy was brutally simple: never hold cash. The moment money arrived in your hands, you got rid of it. Not by saving it, not by depositing it in a bank, but by immediately converting it into something, anything, of real physical value. A kilo of potatoes, a candle, a pair of shoes 2 sizes too large that you could trade later, a bar of soap, coal for the winter. The logic was merciless. The longer you held paper marks, the less they were worth. So spending immediately was not recklessness. It was wisdom. People who hesitated, who held on to their savings out of habit or hope, were punished. People who acted instantly, who spent without sentiment, preserved more of their real wealth. This required a complete psychological rewiring. Generations of Germans had been raised to save, to be prudent, to accumulate. The hyperinflation reversed that entire value system overnight. Saving became dangerous, spending became survival. Those who had access to foreign currency, American dollars, British pounds, Dutch guilders, were in an entirely different position. A single US dollar in late 1923 could feed a family of 4 for a week. Those Germans who had foreign contacts, who worked for international companies, or who had relatives abroad, could exchange tiny amounts of foreign currency at rates that made them temporarily wealthy in local terms. A young secretary working for an American company in Berlin described in her diary how she would receive her salary in dollars, immediately convert a small portion to marks at the black market rate, spend those marks within hours, and repeat the process the next day. She called it surfing the collapse. Those who could surf it survived better. Those who could not drowned. The second survival strategy involved a complete reimagining of what money actually was. If paper currency was worthless, then real value had to be stored in real things. Gold and silver were the obvious choices. Metals that no government could print, metals with intrinsic value recognized across borders and centuries. Those who had gold jewelry, silver cutlery, coins from earlier eras rushed to convert them into necessities. Pawnshops became some of the most important institutions in Weimar, Germany. Entire family heirlooms, grandmother's brooch, grandfather's pocket watch, the silver candelabra that had sat on the dining table for 40 years, were traded for sacks of flour and jars of lard. The middle class, which had been the most careful savers, was hit the hardest precisely because they had the most to lose. Pensioners who had saved diligently for decades saw their retirement funds reduced to literally nothing. Civil servants, teachers, professors, people whose identities were built around respectability and financial prudence, were reduced to selling their furniture to buy food. But something stranger and more creative was happening alongside the tragedy. Communities began to invent their own money. All across Germany, towns, cities, local businesses, even individual farms began issuing what became known as Notgeld, literally emergency money. These were small paper notes, or sometimes tokens made of leather, ceramic, or compressed coal dust, issued by local authorities and backed not by government promises but by real goods. A coal mine in the Ruhr Valley issued certificates redeemable for specific quantities of coal. A regional dairy cooperative issued milk tokens. A brewery in Bavaria issued beer certificates. A group of farmers in Thuringia issued grain vouchers backed by their actual harvest. These microcurrencies worked because they were honest. They represented something real, something you could touch and use. And they circulated within communities that trusted each other, communities small enough that reputation and relationships mattered more than legal tender laws. This was the third survival strategy, and in many ways the most profound one, the reconstruction of trust at the local level when trust in institutions had completely collapsed. When the national currency failed, people turned to each other. Neighbor networks formed spontaneously in apartment buildings and city blocks. People shared information about which shops still had food, which farmers were willing to trade, which streets had informal markets. Buying cooperatives emerged. Groups of families who pooled whatever resources they had to buy in bulk, splitting goods among themselves at prices none of them could have afforded individually. Women's networks were particularly important. In a society where women largely managed household economies, they became the primary nodes of informal community exchange. They knew who had surplus eggs, who needed coal, who was willing to trade a winter coat for 6 months of bread deliveries. And then there were the Hamsterfahrten, the hamster trips. As conditions in cities became increasingly desperate, hundreds of thousands of urban Germans began making regular journeys into the countryside. Backpacks and bags stuffed with whatever valuables they still possessed. A wedding ring, a silk dress, a set of porcelain cups, anything a farmer might want in exchange for food. They called themselves hamsterer, hoarders, because they moved through the countryside gathering provisions the way hamsters stuff their cheeks, carrying as much as they possibly could back to their urban burrows. Farmers, for their part, found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. For the first time in generations, the people who grew food were wealthier than the people who managed banks. A farmer with potatoes, turnips, and wheat was a rich man in 1923 Germany, and he knew it. Some farmers were generous, trading fairly with desperate city families. Others drove hard bargains, extracting pianos, paintings, and family silverware for modest quantities of food. The rural-urban power dynamic inverted completely, almost overnight. Those urban families who had any outdoor space, a balcony, a small garden, a strip of earth beside a building, began growing food with an intensity that had not been seen since wartime. Window boxes that had held flowers were replanted with radishes and herbs. Strips of grass in courtyards became potato patches. Communities negotiated access to public park land for vegetable growing. The act of growing even a small amount of your own food was not just practically valuable, it was psychologically sustaining. It gave people a sense of agency, of control, in a situation where almost everything felt beyond their control. A woman who could grow her own tomatoes was not entirely dependent on a monetary system that had gone insane. She had something real, something she had made with her own hands, something no government could inflate away. Toward the end of 1923, as the hyperinflation reached its most extreme levels, a remarkable social phenomenon emerged in German cities: the Tauschzentrale, or exchange centers. These were organized barter markets, often held in town halls, school gymnasiums, or church halls, where people could bring goods and services to trade directly with other community members. A dentist might offer tooth extractions in exchange for winter vegetables. A tailor would repair clothing in exchange for firewood. A musician would give piano lessons in exchange for cooking oil. A photographer would take family portraits in exchange for preserved meats. Skills, labor, and goods circulated through these exchange centers in a complex web of mutual support that had nothing to do with the official currency. They were, in effect, entire local economies operating in parallel to the collapsed national one. And they worked. Not perfectly, not without friction and inequality, but well enough to keep communities fed, clothed, and functional during months of extraordinary chaos. The hyperinflation ended abruptly in November 1923, when the German government introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold, as was traditional, but by land. Agricultural land, industrial land, the physical territory of Germany itself. It was a radical and somewhat improvised solution, but it worked with surprising speed. Within weeks of the Rentenmark's introduction, prices stabilized, the exchange rate held, markets calmed. The crisis, which had seemed infinite and unsurvivable, ended with almost anticlimactic suddenness. But the damage was permanent and profound. An entire generation of middle-class Germans had been financially destroyed. Trust in institutions, in banks, in government, in paper money, in the systems that were supposed to protect ordinary people had been shattered. The psychological scars of the hyperinflation shaped German political culture for decades. They help explain why, nearly a century later, Germany remains one of the most inflation-averse societies in the world, why the German public is so resistant to monetary risk, why the memory of those wheelbarrows of worthless cash remains so vivid in the German national consciousness. What those ordinary Germans taught us. Through their suffering, their creativity, their resourcefulness, can be distilled into a few essential truths. Real wealth is not what is printed on paper. It is stored in skills, in relationships, in physical goods, in land, in the trust of your community. When large systems fail, small systems, neighborhoods, cooperatives, local networks, can sustain life if they are built on genuine relationships rather than abstract financial instruments. And the people who survive economic catastrophe are not always the strongest or the richest or the most educated. They are the most adaptable, the ones willing to abandon old assumptions about how the world works and find new ways to create value in whatever reality they find themselves in. Next week, we travel to Zimbabwe in 2008, where inflation reached numbers so large that the government printed a $100 trillion bill, a banknote with 14 zeros, and where ordinary people developed survival strategies even more inventive than those of Weimar Germany. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. And before you go, tell us in the comments which of these survival strategies surprised you most. Which one do you think would still work today? We read every comment, and your answer might shape our next episode.